Hello and welcome. I'm Olga Hannane, and this is Academia Experience, where we discuss topical academic phenomena in everyday language. Today, we are at the University College London to meet with Dr. Karen Wilkes, who is a lecturer in critical media studies. Hello, Karen, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Olga.
Yeah, today we will be talking about the Caribbean, and this is one of your research areas of interest. When I hear about the Caribbean islands, I have the picture of island paradise, and I know that you worked a little bit, or actually researched how the image of the paradise has been constructed. So, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my area of research, and one of them is on the Caribbean, but on the visual language that is used in tourism promotional materials. And I was particularly interested in the way that myths of paradise or ideas of escape and luxury are packaged in a visual form. And so what I noticed was these repeated ideas about empty beaches, devoid of any real kind of urban context. And also these repeated images could be anywhere in the Caribbean. So there was no way of distinguishing the island states between each other. And so that's what I tended to find when I started to look at these images. But also what I started to notice is the way that a particular product was being constructed around weddings and using the region to host what is now known as destination weddings, and kind of coupling that with the all-inclusive package. So this was a kind of a new development in response to being able to kind of protect tourists in the sense that, ideas of them being unhassled, or not having any real contact with local people. It meant that the tourism promoter of the resort could control the experience that the tourist was having. And that's what I started to notice. All these things were coming together. So these ideas of paradise, escape, access to largely unpopulated beaches, all of these kinds of ideas. But what I also noticed, it was heavily dependent on references or tropes to colonialism, and the idea that part of this luxury was about the service that you could get, and what that service was actually referencing that history. And that's one of the things that I noticed. So one of the products that I was particularly interested in was this idea that you could have an all-inclusive service that included a butler that was on hand all the way through your stay. So that person was dedicated to you throughout your visit. So these are the kinds of things that were of interest to me when I was looking at the images.
And you mentioned that you were looking into destination weddings. So is there a particular island or nation, island state that you worked with? Or?
Yeah, so I was particularly interested in Jamaica, and in particular how, as I say, that those tropes or those ideas about colonialism were being repeated, but particularly the staging of weddings in the what used to be called the Great White Houses. So the plantation houses that were turned into tourist residences, and that's what you started to see. What I started to observe in the images was that the hotels were being named after plantation houses, and so what I started to see again, this another set of ideas or myths that were being created around getting married in what was a reconstructed colonial site, and using those references. So particular what I saw was repeated references to white. So, the White House, white beaches, and also really fitting in with that discourse of weddings, and using those ideas and repeating them, throughout the promotional material.
white dress. That's you.
A white dress and a white dress. So yeah, so particularly using the white dress as a kind of a hook, if you like, and then all the decor surrounding that was to echoed those ideas of this elaborate white dress.
I see. That's very interesting. And this is a picture that is created for tourists and consumers. But what about the other side, the service providers and local populations?
So this was one of the things that I found that was quite problematic, in that that the region is heavily dependent on tourism for its its income generation. And I particularly wanted to understand, well, what are the terms of being able to welcome tourists in this way? And one of the things that I noticed was how, the local populations were often only welcomed into the resorts, or say would work in the resorts. They weren't particularly able to necessarily use the facilities or the beaches. So there was a particular trend in the 1990s of beaches being privatised, and people not having access to beaches that were once public, and also particularly concerned with the way that the wages tend to be low, and because tourism work is seasonal, and I understand that this is not just a case of the Caribbean, but when when business is slow, that those workers are then let go. So it could just position them in as quite precarious, and then you're just responding to those demands of the tourism industry, which as we saw with the pandemic, you have to respond to what is happening globally, but it does leave them quite precarious. So these are the kinds of things that I'm particularly interested in looking at, how those people who are actually doing the labour, doing the work, what are their conditions in relation to what they're servicing. Following the pandemic, I was interested in how the region is responding to the fall in tourism numbers, and what they were doing in response to that. So that's how I've come to really be interested in digital nomads and what that means for the region. So I'm particularly interested in how that's going to really impact on the current situation of food insecurity, which is a big issue in the region. That most of the region's food is imported. And so how that is going to basically work out, if they're inviting people into the region, what is that going to mean for local people, because prices of food are already quite high. So these are the kinds of things I'm interested in.
This is a very interesting point, because when we hear about the Caribbean and tourism in the Caribbean, we do not usually hear about issues of food insecurity or any other downsides.
And I think that's interesting, because tourism has been considered a success for the region in that it's enabled many of the island states to service their debts. And prior to the pandemic, there were some positive comments being made about how the debts were being serviced, and tourism was a tool of empowerment, it was described. But one of the things, the difficulties of that is the way in which those sets of debts have been serviced. I think largely through low wages, to keep the region competitive, that they keeping wages low. That's been one of the consequences, and I think that there is a contradiction in saying that it's empowering. Yes, it is very labour intensive, and it does mean that lots of people are employed, but the terms under which they're employed does still render them quite precarious, and really at response of what's happening in terms of what tourists want. So I'm particularly interested in looking at maybe how digital nomad, how this trend is going to play out for the region. In particular, if tourists who are largely affluent are coming to the region, what kinds of demands will they be coming with? What will their expectations be? So, in terms of, food, what kinds of food will they be expecting? Which has to be imported into the region. I don't think is necessarily going to address the current issue of food insecurity, which already exists. So that, that's some of the concerns that I'm particularly interested in looking at. And also, with respect to, for example, internet access for the region is quite expensive. So, for digital nomads, I would imagine that is one of the things that you would be looking for, is that having really good, internet access that in order to be able to do that work, that you need good internet and reliable internet access. So they're the kinds of things that I'm interested in exploring more as this trend continues.
Yeah, and before the recording, we were talking that the price of internet in Barbados is
the sixth highest,
in the world.
Yeah, it's high. It's quite expensive. So if, for example, the local population don't have access to things which perhaps in the global north are considered utilities now, not necessarily as considered to be luxuries, then there are power relationships there that I think do need to be examined.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of digital nomads and looking at the Caribbean islands visa programs, digital nomad visa programs, they've been among the pioneering island nations in general who were launching digital nomad visas as a reaction to the loss of visitors during the pandemic. Yeah. So they were the first ones, and when you look at the prices of digital nomad visas, they are among the highest in the world. Yeah. I checked that, for example, Antigua and Barbuda has the cost of the visa is $1,500, which is not a cheap visa fee. No. And the income threshold or minimum income that is required is over $4,000 per month. So they really targeting a specific group of nomads, I would say, who really can afford to travel to the Caribbean and stay in the Caribbean.
Yeah. So there is a concerted effort really to target tourists or visitors who have a certain level of income. And I guess what I'm interested in is, what is that going to do to the local population? Where are those digital nomads going to live? If you're asking visitors to come and stay for like periods of 6 months to a year, that I would be thinking, well, what kinds of services are they going to be expecting? Where are they going to live, and how's that going to affect the local population? Is that going to have an impact, for example, on housing, on food prices locally, and as we've also discussed on internet access. So if you're inviting people to come and live and really settle for a period, what services are going to be provided that perhaps the local population are not necessarily getting.
That's an important point to make, as now we hear in the news that digital nomads are increasingly accused of issues of gentrification and housing prices that they are adding up to the gentrification processes that have been going on, or over-tourism issues that have been present in certain destinations already. I know. Like, for example, I know in Portugal that those issues are
quite current that where people want to go and work, where they want to, where their workspace is, what that means for local people in terms of basic everyday things, like if you want to go and get a drink, being able to engage with local businesses, what that means for them if the attention is then turned towards visitors and perhaps not the local population. So it's how that is going to be managed really in the Caribbean, given that it already has a history of unequal power relationships. How is that going to be played out is really quite a concern of mine, really.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for sharing your important insights about the Caribbean region and tourism context there.
Thank you, real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Check out academia experience elsewhere.